Warrior cultures of the past, such as the Greeks, the Romans, the Native Americans, welcome their military warriors home in rituals of storytelling. We follow that tradition and create a modern interpretation of homecoming for all veterans, that's whether they served home or abroad. The Veteran Voices program is designed to cultivate a thriving and compassionate environment for our veterans and the family members of veterans to speak their truths, share their experiences, and bear witness together. Now, on to our first guest. We are excited to welcome Drew Pham to the show tonight. Drew is a queer, transgender writer of Vietnamese heritage, a child of war refugees, and an adjunct English lecturer at CUNY Brooklyn College. She has published in Blunderbuss Magazine, McSweeny Slice Magazine, Foreign Policy, Time Magazine, The Daily Beast, and Columbia Journal, among others. She serves as an editor at the Wrath-Bearing Tree, an online literary journal focused on the themes of societal violence. Previously, she served in the U.S. Army and deployed to Afghanistan with the 10th Mountain Division. She presented original work in Veteran Voices program in 2017 and has since participated in 7 Poetic Theater Productions events as a writer, a performer, and a curator. She is currently in the process, with Omar and I, of curating our next Veteran Voices Writing and Performance Workshop series. Welcome, Drew! Drew, did you want to say anything?
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. I guess I'll start with a piece of prose, and then we'll go into the interview. This is from a novel that has not been published, so fingers crossed. And the title is Watchfire. She had been named David Min Tran, the auspicious firstborn boy to the eldest child in her family. She had been born and given a name that did not fit, so replaced it with D, a name that only her friends used. She'd been given a place in the family hierarchy that did not suit, and lived in a country that did not love her because of her skin and what lay beneath that skin. She had liked playing with dolls, liked the friendship of other girls over the boys she'd been nudged to roughhouse with, and would always stare in the mirror, wondering why she had never felt that reflection ever read true. Her grandmother had once said that it had been a shame she hadn't been born a girl. This shamed her. Her father often said that he couldn't understand why she couldn't be more of a man. This angered her. Her mother saw in her a man who'd never been there, one whose place she could never take. And this saddened her. And yet she continued on with her life, going through the playground and high school and college, the night she lost her virginity, and the day she said yes to a proposal of marriage, and the day she stepped on a plane bound for Afghanistan, speaking like a boy, thinking like a boy, behaving as boys are taught to behave. She had done these things so often and so well that when the day came that she'd revealed herself for who she was, not a man, but a woman, many could not understand what had happened to her or why she'd done them such violence. In time, she would flower into the woman she was, imperfect, but a flower nonetheless. But this is not that kind of story. They flew to Romania. It was cleaner than Sofia had been a year ago, all brushed steel and panes of glass. It didn't smell like raw sewage, the benefits of capitalism, the gifts of military partnership. The people in the terminal acted like the throngs of soldiers weren't there, as if their camouflage had truly rendered them invisible. Dee half listened to the troops chattering, got sick of it, tried to concentrate on something else, something to clear her mind, some kind of escape. She drank the rest of her cough syrup. It only gave her a couple more hours rest. She woke up hacking again. The sun was still out, higher in the sky than she'd hoped. She tried to watch a movie, some comedy directed by a has-been that was set in Paris. Owen Wilson was in it, but Dee couldn't enter the dream of the story. She wondered if she'd return to an empty house. She had planned for the worst and hoped for the best. Best case scenario, Miri would be there. They'd run into each other's arms and she'd tell her she was sorry for everything. It didn't matter what she had or hadn't done, she was sorry. She was ready to apologize for it, for all of it. The planes flying into the towers, global fucking warming, the inevitable heat death of the universe. She would claim responsibility if it meant Miri would stay with her. They'd go home and eat something that hadn't been frozen and flown 1,000 miles to a base. They'd fuck, they'd sleep in a bed, and in the morning, she'd take a shit on a toilet that flushed. Or Miri wouldn't be there. She'd have to get a ride. She didn't know where. She wondered if Barker had a spare room, if he'd tolerate having his lieutenants over, or if that'd ruin Kelly's big plans, if they had plans. Maybe deployments were like years of marriage. Maybe in time, passion slowed and everyone involved fell into a complacent routine, but more than likely, the couple would want to fuck away a year of not fucking anyone. A warm body was still appealing, no matter how strained their marriage had become. And Dee couldn't stay in the barracks. No billets for officers. She didn't know where the apartment Miri had leased would be. And that was still an hour away on a lonely 2-lane highway. She could always find a hotel to stay in just off post. There was the Class 6. She could get a handle of something. It didn't matter as long as it was over 80 proof. She could masturbate again, climb into the bottle and fall asleep. It might be best if she spent some time alone. On the screen, Owen Wilson had just traveled back in time to the 20s and Hemingway was being an asshole. Dee wondered if the airline picked these movies intentionally, if they'd specifically chosen something stupid and numbing as if to tell the men flying back from a war zone that nothing they just experienced mattered, that people would go on making art for art's sake, that moviegoers across the country didn't care that they were losing what promised to be their longest war, that anonymous brown people were still dying in droves in a country they couldn't find on a map. And that Dee's marriage, the one bright spot in the shitty little life she'd made for herself, for all she knew, was about to end. But it wasn't their fault, was it? They wouldn't say so. They'd blame her for being too poor to go to college on her own, for joining up even though she knew better, for pulling the trigger all those times. No one ever held a gun to her head, but fuck them anyway. She took off her headphones, lay across the row of seats, and longed for a catastrophic malfunction that would send their airliner to the bottom of the Atlantic, or at least a better movie than the one currently playing. She had never simply been a girl. How can any man and woman, anyone of any gender, be entirely and only one thing? But she remembered when he came for her, like a spirit, like a guardian angel, like a shield, like the uncertain and desperate grasping for meaning that is a mixed metaphor. She remembered needing him. She'd been a child, that much she knew. Though the exact age escaped her, she remembered her father, the man who smelled of the past, of desperation and longing. She remembered his firm grasp on her hair, the bruising grip on her arm, the rough pressure of his palms pressing down on her hips. She remembered pain, so much pain and not much else. She remembered when the boy came and took her hand, this child named David, this auspicious firstborn boy whose name fit, who did his filial duty and loved the country that had given him and his family freedom, though what freedom meant she did not know. But what he offered wasn't freedom, but defense. Defense that her slim wrists and love of soft things could not provide. Defense from the rupture rending her each time she peered into the mirror. Defense from men and the things they do to girls. He offered a body that would take blows for her, one that would carry her when she was too weak to go on, one that would fight for her. Like so many young girls and women, she accepted his hand without understanding what she'd agreed to. He would give her all the things he promised. He would even love her and then eventually leave her when the time came. But he gave her other things. He gave her rage. He gave her aggression. He gave her a sword that he convinced her she needed, one whose grip would not loosen for many years. She would go on through her life, through the breadth and length of this story, thinking she needed David more than anyone else. But in the end, the truth was that he needed her more than she ever needed him. The plane landed, taxied to a spot on the tarmac with no covered gangway. It rained ice, October in Canada. They had no wet weather tops, no snivel gear, just their threadbare summer uniforms to shield them as they sprinted across the runway to the entrance. It was a good thing they landed to refuel in Nova Scotia because Dee didn't know what she'd do if someone had tried to stop her and thank her for her service. She liked to think she'd punch them right in the gut, but probably she'd do nothing but imagine creative ways the dumb civilian's head might be liberated from his body instead. They ate whatever food was available in the terminal, and most of the chalk crowded around the one bar to buy their 2 allotted beers. No hard liquor permitted. It wouldn't do for anyone to pass out in ranks at the welcome home ceremony, though they still had hours to go. Aside from the thirsty soldiers, the terminal was empty. Nova Scotia seemed like one of those places people only flew away from. The payphones had all been pulled out of their sockets. Maybe the departing Nova Scotians took them with them. Their next stop was Alexandria International Airport. She had become a soldier. She had volunteered to fill the ranks of an all-volunteer army. The conscription that had once been the rule in times of war, now a seemingly distant memory. Yet she did not feel she had a choice. She hadn't chosen her body, hadn't chosen her country, nor had she ever chosen the 2 parents whose war hadn't ever seemed to leave them. The boy inside her had told her it was safer to be a man, a soldier. The world had told her she did not belong in this country, that she would need to prove that she belonged here. Her parents, their silences, their rages, their tears, all told her that she could never understand them unless she knew what had wounded them so. She needed to know violence by the cuts it left in her hands when she reached into the past. She needed to smell the blood and gunpowder. She needed to hear the moans and bombs. She needed to taste bile on her tongue at the sound of a siren's wail and a bullet's crack. She needed to see it, whatever it was that had hurt her parents before she'd ever been born. These are the consequences, or there are consequences, of course. She began to truly think of herself not as herself, but the man the boy asked her to be. For all the choices she'd made in life, love another woman, kill another man, reject the man in the mirror who'd become a stranger, none would cause her so much pain as letting the boy she pretended to be grow into a man whose hands never left the slender stem of her neck. Were this another kind of story, she would come to learn who she was. Were she a brave kind of woman, she would triumph over an obstacle that had kept her shackled all her life. Were this a happy ending, you would not watch this woman posing as a man in her dusty uniform from a defeated army, returning home to this crumbling empire. A tidy story like that requires a tidy triumph, in which the hero is a hero, the villain a villain, the day finally saved. The plane broke out of the wind and rain. Dee remembered something from jump school, how they could always drop in the rain, but once the wind picked up, they'd scrub a flight, no questions asked. It was too bad they didn't scrub this one. The plane chased daylight down the coast over the fields and cities and suburban infill, which spread across the ground like a cancer. They dipped low and circled over Acadiana, over I-49 and the Kisatchie and the Red River, over the little airport's runway, and somewhere down there were all the families who'd sent their boys and girls off to war. One family whom she'd written a letter to, whom she'd let down, a kid who'd never see his daddy again, and a bitter ex-wife who wouldn't even get a folded American flag at the funeral. Somewhere down there was Miri. Like Schrodinger's cat, their lives together would either go on or was already long dead. The plane touched down and they took up their rifles and machine guns for the last time, deplaned onto the seething tarmac. It was too hot for October. A color guard was there, dressed up like soldiers from the Continental Army. Cute, D got it. Task Force Minuteman, Revolutionary War. Fucking cute. The base general waited at the bottom of the steps to shake everyone's hand. D thought he smelled like whiskey. You've done such a great job. What loyal, brave boys you've been. Even if he'd known that D dropped a mortar round on a school, the general would probably have said the same damn thing. They boarded buses, which drove them away from the airport down the little highway to post an hour away. Everyone chattered about pussy and fast food and hard liquor. They were free, finally free from humping half their body weight up mountains and worrying that roadside bombs would blow off their cocks. And the question of what the fuck it actually was they'd been fighting for. D was alone in this. She didn't feel free or at home. She didn't know where home was, the country to which she swore allegiance or the country they'd left behind. The sun escaped behind the horizon. It was dark. The chatter stopped and half of them fell asleep. The other half were quiet. The pinelands passed through the window, and if you squinted, they might resemble the green zone at night, those dense valleys in which they'd stalked and fought and killed and died. The buses pulled through the gates, down the one-ways bisecting the cantonment area, past the company S&As, the battalion headquarters, the motor pools, down to a field house owned by the sustainment brigade. The parking lot was full and 100 cars were parked on the grass so zealously guarded by senior NCOs, now ripped to shreds by family minivans and big SUVs. They got off the bus, were made to lay their kit out in neat rows before falling into ranks to tromp into the field house before the big reveal for their waiting families. They marched. The general was inside at the podium. So were the Continental soldiers who sweated under their powdered wigs and their tailored woolen coats. A march played. British Grenadiers, D thought. Someone had a hard-on for history but hadn't done their homework. Right period, wrong side. Behind the general sat the families, the women and children and elderly fathers in their VFW garrison caps. Dee searched the crowd for Miri, but could only look ahead as she marched into place. The national anthem played. The soldiers presented arms. The general gave his speech, the same speech he'd probably given a half dozen times to the rest of the chalks of the brigade as they'd returned plane by plane. How proud he was that they'd heralded democracy at the farthest reaches of the world. How America was safer for all their hard-fought sacrifices. How noble they'd been in their fight to win the hearts and minds of the Afghan people, blah, blah, fuckity blah. Then the division song played, but the men didn't know the words, so they hummed along. Dee could hear Barker singing through, replacing infantry with cavalry as he blared on. The army song played. Everyone knew the words. Dee scanned the crowd. She knew Miri had chopped off all her hair. She looked for her face, her glasses, her elegant nose, her bright eyes. She had to be there. She needed to be. She slipped a hand into her pocket. There, her lucky ring, Miri's ring, the three interlocking loops of silver. It hadn't let her down once. It had brought her back to her. She closed her fingers around it, placed it around her thumb. It couldn't let her down, not now. The families applauded, their hands snapping the wet, cyclic snap of machine guns, of near misses and close calls. This, the friendly fire of the worst order. They applauded a lie, that bright, shining lie that had brought them all together and sent these soldiers, these children, to repeat the mistakes the last generation had tried their best to forget. But Dee would have to let it go, all of it, if it meant she was there, if Miri was there. The formation broke ranks. Families ran from the stands into their soldiers' arms. Lovers embraced, kissed the kisses of a victorious army, though they fought no decisive battles, accepted no army's surrender. They kissed like it was all over, like it was behind them, like they had all the time in the world to heal their wounds and let the dead fade into the backgrounds of their lives and let the war slip from memory like a dark dream slips from a dreamer at first light. Dee searched the crowd for the slight stoop Miri had inherited from her father, for the dark undersides of her eyes, the same as her mother's. An old man passed in front of her, the medals on his cap glinting. A woman worried the straps of her handbag. A child, ignorant of his newfound strength, crumpled the end of a homemade sign that read, "Welcome home, mommy." If Miri was there, Dee would tell her to carry her far away from her, reassure her that they'd wake up from all of this like it was a bad dream, that they'd run away, flip the MPs the bird as they drove off. She'd hurl her medals at the Pentagon, renounce that oath to protect and defend that thing masquerading as freedom. She'd tell her she loved her more than the war, more than the cocaine rush of battle in her veins, that they'd have children, a girl like she'd always wanted, a boy who'd dote on her. They'd be beautiful. They'd have her angled jaw and Miri's elegant nose and their black eyes. She'd promised her that they would never have to endure the silences and distances of a father that looked backwards, that she'd strike war from her heart, and they'd never have to take up arms as she had, never have to carry on the long legacy of violence that had trapped her in its thrall. Together, they would find all the pieces of her scattered through history in the moldering row house in Alexandria, Virginia, on the shores of the Red River Delta, on the day that Saigon fell and inherited that dead revolutionary's name, in the peaks and valleys of the Alasangar Mountains, and in the bleached bone of that cleric's school, and in the fallow field where Dee had buried her heart. One day, the war would be over, and they'd put her all back together again, bit by bit. One day. In a break in the crowd, she saw, there in the gap the old veteran left, past the child, past the woman, past the soldiers and girlfriends and fathers and brothers, was Miri, searching. Were this any other kind of story, we would not see her would we not see her blossom into full bloom? But this is not her story. These are not her hands tending the soil, but a man's. And what of the soil from which she'll one day sprout? What can we say of it that does not hold the apathetic stone and gas, the rot and decay, the shit and death that constitutes it? And what of her unfolding petals, so ephemeral? What shall we do with a story like this when she withers and dies, crumbling into so many molecules strewn across that same rotted soil, tended by those same hands with their power to both create and destroy? Thank you. That's where I'll stop.
Thank you, Drew. Thank you so much. First question for you. What inspired you to write this piece and share it tonight?
Well, I actually revised it. It had originally been the whole not I started the novel, and originally my character was white and basically nondescript because I didn't think anyone could connect with um a Vietnamese soldier, that like a Vietnamese American soldier's story. And then I began to add in my own heritage because the more I wrote about the war, the more people were asking me, well, why is it that you feel so strongly about the connections between the so-called global war on terror and the American war in Vietnam?
Mm.
So part of that project of including my own heritage was a way of, like, the protagonist, of trying to better understand my parents, of trying to more clearly see their pain, because obviously going to war and experiencing violence and seeing the anguish that many Afghan civilians had gone through by merit of our presence, like that alone it didn't feel like enough to connect me to my parents' experience or to my mother. Um, so I decided to begin writing about it. And then as I was writing, I went through this long process of self-discovery in which I discovered my own queerness through another character that I'd written, who was a closeted gay man and like a proto-transgender Afghan girl. The tradition is called bacha. It's bacha push, not bacha bazi, but bacha push. Um, Two different things, in which young girls dress up as teenage boys or young men in order to go out and provide for their families because of a lot of cultural difficulties that they may experience depending on where they live. And in writing about queerness, in writing about trans identity, that's when I went back and began editing with a very clear transgender through line, in which every other character that has a POV, point of view chapter, refers to D as he. But in her chapters, she's referred to as, she uses she, her pronouns, which very much feels like the experience of being a closeted trans woman. I couldn't figure out how to elegantly put that in there until I just was like, well, what if I've been misgendering my main character this whole time? So like, how do I, well, just call her by her proper pronouns and we'll be good. And it worked out.
Yeah, I noticed that. I noticed that right away. The differences and the distinctions, which really brought the piece alive, and then also brought the protagonist even more accessible to us as the audience to understand that different point of view or multiple points of view.
That's the wonderful thing about the use of point of view, I feel, because yeah, we naturally will use the first person, of course, but with the first person, it's so often confessional. We're like trying to reveal something deeply internal, and with the second person, whenever we say like, "Oh, well, you know how," and then you might describe, and then you're sitting there at the bus station, and some guy just catcalls you, and using the second person to put the narrative upon the reader, and then the third person, which people think is like, oh, well, that's traditional, and maybe that's like too like normative for me. Well, the really wonderful thing about the third person is you get to dip into people's consciousnesses in a way that isn't necessarily possible when they're being performative. um,
I really
Sorry
like
about
that
that.
you.
I'm
No,
also
no apologies. We don't do any apologies on our interview session show. I am grateful to hold this space for you and for the audience to be present for you as well. I also enjoyed how you really embodied the piece, even though we're sitting and we're not on a stage. You brought us in, you introduced everything. So it was very poetic theater in that way. So it was really beautiful. But we definitely want to see more of your work as well. So now let's jump right in with a clip from Veteran Voices 2017. This piece is called After Action by Drew Pham.
Gunpowder clings to me like perfume. Who's this body in front of me? A Haji is dead and that's enough. The books say I'm supposed to feel sick to my stomach. Our glands are programmed against homicide, but that isn't me. No one ever told me how good this would feel, firing on all cylinders, nicotine after sex. Did I shoot this man? No holes in him but mine. Mine. I must be smiling. The others are Elraz and 8 Mile smiling. Fuck, that was some 25 to life shit, says Elraz. Worst thing a man can do. No one can take this from me. God damn, sir, you straight up executed his ass. 8 Mile makes a gun with his fingers, points at that jihadi fuck while he does a little touchdown dance, careful to keep his hand on his rifle. The new guy's rattled, his face blanches like he did it. He's trying not to look at me. I saw it, sir, he was going for his weapon. Shit, if the LT wasn't so quick on the draw, I'd have murked his ass. You think he shit himself? 8 Mile says. Fossil, you're smelling the load in your pants, you scared bitch. Elraz says, you punk ass. Shut the fuck up and watch your fucking sectors, I say. But they keep their smiles and I don't blame them. We just closed with and destroyed the enemy. Every combat soldier's wet dream. My brain feels like cotton balls soaked in 80 proof. Fuck me, I just smoked a dude. I aim my camera at the Mooj, laying face up. His pants are undone, swimming around his thighs. He's dressed in a brown vest over his gray-blue shalwar kameez and white high-top sneakers. A Chicon chest rack is stretched across his chest. The pouch is pregnant with ammunition. The camera lens focuses, then whines and winks. Now his body is immortal. A story by Tim O'Brien comes to mind. In college, I read his reflection on killing a man, and he tried to picture the gorilla in life, but could do nothing but stare at his body, jaw in his throat, slender, a star-shaped hole where his eye once was. Back then I thought, if that was one of my uncles lying at his feet, I would forgive O'Brien. I searched myself for a hint of his guilt, his empathic imagination, and find none. I admired O'Brien's sympathy once, but I don't have a conscript's small heart. I volunteered for this. I did a warrior's work. Before graduating from college, my advisor said the Army was a waste of time. Why do you want to go to war? If you want to see it, just turn on the TV. Your family's experience is such fertile ground for important academic work, he told me. I was sick of being a victim in a family of fucking refugees. I never told him that I wanted to be the first kid in my class to get a confirmed kill. No one would call me a victim after that. Now, after years of training for this moment, months of chasing Mooj through this valley, I have what I wanted at my feet. Apache gunships float over the mountains looking for targets. I stay with the Haji and the men spread out to take cover on the little berm around the fallow field.
Oh my goodness, that is so weird to watch.
I was going to ask you that exact question. Can you speak about this moment? Like where you were, mind, body, soul, all the things?
It's strange. I mean, that was one of the first short stories that I ever had published. And even the emotional tone of it, it feels really foreign to me because now my writing, I feel, is much more holding of many experiences of, and maybe is kinder in a way, softer and quieter. And I'm much better at reading now. um, but yeah, it's strange because I'm looking at this man who had been, a boy when he went to war. And I can see how much pain he's in.
Mm.
I can see how closed off he is to himself. And honestly, it's a little heartbreaking, but thankfully I do know like where he'll end up. So in that way, I am heartened by the growth. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I'm wondering what your reaction is actually.
Sometimes I feel like I knew the Drew in the video, and now I'm just getting to know the Drew I'm speaking to now. So it's like a huge arc to be your friend, to be a fellow veteran, to see the just the beautiful evolution. And working with you now is really helpful. It's helped us evolve the Veteran Voices program with the curation. So yeah, I'm grateful, and that's kind of what it's like for me. Omar, did you have a question?
I do, and just want to say this for you, Drew. Like, you are really an inspiration. The things you're going through and expressing through your art and your performance, and that's where my question comes from. Just as far as your military experiences that you had on active duty, how did they affect how you now just do your art as far as performance and writing? How did it affect how
Yeah,
you?
I mean, on the one hand, and on a just a normal, like kind of a logistical way, I was able to enter into writing and be able to stand up in front of a crowd of strangers and read a piece of work, bare my soul in a sense. And that was easy because I'd had to do that in the military, and being able to project and being able to like have a presence in the room. These are all things that were helpful. But at the same time, when I think back on my active duty experience, I, again, feel really sad because I think about all the things that I had suppressed in myself. And I remember I was in Afghanistan when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed. And my gunner on my truck actually came out to me as bi, and I was so proud that he was so brave as to do that. But at the same time, even though I knew I was queer, and even though I'd always wanted to be a woman, like I couldn't. I couldn't, because as an officer, it's different. I felt as any leader, a senior NCO or a senior specialist or whoever they may be, because then my performance would become a liability. Oh, well, look at that. Without excuse the language, but they'd probably be like, oh, look at that fag, like what are they going to do when the bullets start flying? And it wouldn't have mattered if I had been like well performing in combat. I used to hear things like when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was on the table to be repealed, I used to hear things like, oh, well, what if someone in my truck is gay and they want to like unzip my pants and start blowing me? I'm like, bitch, no one wants to suck your dick. But yeah, no, but that's the environment and that we grew up in. And out in the wider world in the 90s, being trans was a sideshow. It was like, oh, tonight on 60 Minutes, a bunch of fucking weirdos. Even though these were human beings with their own desires and emotional landscapes, that was being erased because of this homophobic and transphobic and basically queerphobic culture that we'd all grown up in civilian life. I remember my dad constantly saying, oh, well, you can't be gay. Like I in elementary school, I told one of my friends that I was gay, and then it spread around and my teacher found out. My teacher called my parents, really concerned about me, and my parents sat me down and my dad was like, you can't be gay because you'll die from AIDS, because AIDS is a gay disease, and shit like that. Just, yeah, when I look back, I just feel so sad about all those things all those experiences and all those joys that had been lost. But at the same time, when I think about that loss, when I think about those erasures. I also return back to my writing and thinking about how the absence of something, or the desire for something that cannot be had in a character, or the constraints of the line of a poem, or the alchemical magic that is fiction writing, poetry writing, playwriting, how each of them takes these constraints and we can make something beautiful out of it. So the first chapter that I just read to y'all is, I think, is just demonstrative of that. Because there is this incredibly big limitation. How do you write a novel, a queer novel about war, when no one can reveal to anyone else who or what they are? So yeah.
So that's an interesting process that you are going through. I mean, a lot of the things that you said resonated with me as a woman veteran. With like, we can't have women in combat, when they were having that big discussion and changing the laws, and I was like, yo, I was already there, and so were like thousands, maybe million, maybe not millions. I like to exaggerate, but like, so many women before me have paved the way, including when you referenced women dressing up as men to serve their country in the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. I mean, it's been happening in America and all around the world for a really long time. So it's an important conversation to have. So we're already headed towards the end here. So we're going to jump right into audience questions.
So our first question is actually an anonymous one. It says, thank you very much for your performance, first of all. They wrote this actually after the first piece that you read. How did you feel after writing that first piece? And is it still evolving, is the question.
Well, I mean, as a writer, everything is still evolving. Even when it's between two covers, you still want to keep revising it. So there's that. And how did I feel after writing the piece? I felt a lot freer than I had felt for a long time in my writing. I think there was a point after I graduated the MFA where I was like, I gotta follow all the rules. I gotta do all the steps in order to get published. But as time went on, I really just wanted to make sure that my character's emotional truths were being done justice. And so I really needed the time for it. I guess I'm on the Donna Tartt schedule of writing a novel every 10 years because I've been working on this for a very long time. But yeah.
That brings us to the next question, because you were already on it, so I'm going to ask it so you can keep going.
Yeah, Melissa Cunningham is asking, do I have a timeline for publication? No, I don't. I did have interest right after I graduated the MFA for representation, but I really wanted to have a finished product first. And because I'm living that adjunct life, excuse the really nice apartment in the background, I got it through the housing lottery. So I pay not very much money. Oh God, that was a Trump gesture. Okay, put that down. Yeah, anyway, living that adjunct life, it's always a question of time and energy and like where you spend that. And I love spending it with my students. And my students actually inspire me to keep writing. So yeah, I guess, let's see. Mary Jo McConnell has our next question. And she's asking, thanks for your exquisite work. Have you interacted with anyone you formerly served with on active duty in your current embodiment of self? I have, and they're all universally surprised when they call me up and they're like, hey, this is Sergeant blah, blah, blah. Is Lieutenant Drew Pham there? Even though I left as a captain. And we're like, hey, yeah, no, Sergeant, it's me. And they're like, no, I'm calling for Pham. It's like, no, that's me. Remember, I'm a girl now. So but the thing is, a lot of the men I'd served with, actually a lot of people in the military that are really vocal about their politics, can be really conservative. And what I found to be really interesting is that when we do end up talking, and they do find out that I'm trans, that suddenly a whole world opens up for them, because it's being trans, being queer, these things aren't abstract to them anymore. Now it's a real human being, and a real human being who has been through the ringer with them. And in that way, I think it's with that sensibility of kind of like familiarizing that which is unfamiliar, which should be the project of any good writer, poet, creative nonfiction writer, playwright, whomever, that allows one to experience something that would otherwise be abstract or just a politicized talking point, and to humanize it. So yeah, that's basically that reaction. Anan says, have any of your readers told you that your writing is therapeutic for them? I've actually not heard that, but if it is therapeutic, that would be wonderful. I do think that what we should strive for in at least realist fiction and a lot of forms of poetry, depending on what school of poetry we're talking about, that writing should activate one's empathic imagination. And through that connection, we might be able to find one another and find community. And I mean, it's interesting because even though I grew up as a Vietnamese kid watching Friday night movies that were about the Vietnam War, and Vietnamese people were just extras. And even though Vietnamese people aren't talking characters with names in Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried, which is still one of my favorite books, I felt so held by the fact that someone chose to write about Vietnamese folks in a way that wasn't like, oh, gooks in the tree line, drop Snake and Nate, blah, blah, blah. Like, I really love this consideration of even a dead man. And what was so interesting is that what had been written in that novel, in the chapters Ambush, Good Form, and there's one more chapter that deals with the same death, that I was able to at least see some humanity and compassion, and that experience was very true to my own lived experience of combat. So yeah.
Thank you for that, Drew. And thank you for co-hosting with me tonight, Jenny. And Drew, we just want to thank you. Thank you for your strength and your vulnerability of being our first guest. We appreciate everything that you do in the veteran community and for the Veteran Voices program specifically. We love working with you, Drew, and we're so grateful to count on you as a member of our community. Know that we hold space for you anytime and that we love you, Drew. And everybody tonight, in 2 weeks, we'll have Maria Salazar on the interview sessions. Maria is a Peruvian American sculptor, poet, and former logistics specialist in the Marine Corps. Can't wait to talk to her. She's founded a nonprofit project called Claymore Vets, whose mission is to use creative exploration with clay to provide veterans with a safe outlet to ignite interpersonal dialogue and to foster reconnection and growth. So come back and join us on February 27th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to get to know Maria. Jenny?
And in the essence of ritual for past and now present warriors, we close the space of vulnerability and truth with a reinforcement. Drew, Omar, and I will be saying something that we learned today or that we're practicing, and we'll breathe together as a community. I encourage the viewers to breathe with us. I'm Jenny Pacanowski, and I reinforce just being on my toes and expecting anything at any moment. Take a deep breath for me. And release. I pass to Drew.
So I am Drew, of course, and I reinforce radical acts of empathy.
Beautiful. Deep breath in for Drew. And release. Go ahead, Omar.
Well, good evening, everybody. Good night. I'm Omar Columbus, and tonight I reinforce the power of community.
Deep breath in for Omar. Deep breath in. And release. And again, thank you for joining our community, choosing thriving and not just surviving. Thank you.